Welcome everyone to this after lunch session. Good to see you, and I'm sure we're in for a good session with Margaret. It's my opportunity and privilege to introduce Margaret this afternoon, and it's one of those funny little things. I've never met Margaret before this weekend, but have known the name. Is that, it can be a bit that way with the Salvation Army. So here's a name of a respected officer who I've known of and heard of over a number of years, and now I can put a face to the name. I don't know how that makes her feel, me saying that, but sort of have heard her name and heard of things that she's done and roles that she's held and awards. I think I remember reading about a preaching award, I think in the UK a few years ago. We'll see how we go. Maybe I'm getting my recollections wrong, but anyway. So I am right. She's just too humble to admit it. That's what I thought, but I wasn't. Yeah. So here is an officer who I've heard of and respected because of what I've heard and what I have picked up along the way. But to give you some of the official bits and pieces from our thing here, Margaret is a New Zealand officer who served, as it says, in a number of core and educational centres, in training principal work in or training colleges in Hong Kong and New Zealand, as well as principal of the International College for Officers. It gives a bit of a background of her education there, but also mentioning that Margaret has a strong interest in the intersection of theology and history, especially with reference to the international reach of the Army and our testimony to gender equality. And I really think that that is a lot of the basis and motivation behind the paper that we're about to hear. So let's welcome Margaret as she comes to share.
This is a case study, as I mentioned, in the dining room of Brigadier Florence Birks. A biography is awaited on this very eminent woman. I don't think it's in me to do it, but it needs to be done by a very competent person. I feel as though Florence is in a way a part of my extended family, and not only mine, but a few other women who have helped me on my journey and have been aware of Florence for a number of years, and who said to me, you ought to sort of bring Florence out because she's become part of the extended family of a number of us. And for me, there are a couple of points, especially as I go through, where I'll mention that Florence connects very closely with me. So to start, you shall be holy, for I am holy. I, the Lord your God, am holy. From the beginning of Scripture, the command echoes. But holy leadership, possible? For starters, as Francis Spufford has pointed out in his new book, Unapologetic, Christianity makes frankly impossible demands of all its followers. It thinks you should give possessions away, refuse to defend yourself, love strangers as much as your own family, behave as if there's no tomorrow, not to mention the requirement to forgive and even love enemies. And then there's the faith's insane perfectionism about motive. So that's the base standard for all believers. Secondly, sort of a higher level, I suppose you could say, Jesus never minced matters about the criteria for holy leadership. Pointing to the current religious leaders, he said to the crowd and his disciples, you must do what they tell you and follow their instructions, but you must not imitate their lives, for they preach but do not practice. Imagine him swinging around then eye to eye with his men. Don't you ever be called rabbi. You have only one teacher, and all of you are brothers. And you must not let anyone call you leaders. You have only one leader, Christ. That's Philip's translation of Matthew 23. Third, then coming to us, another layer, holy leadership down under, down here. Considering that, a leap in time brings us to our own historical context as Salvationists of the South, sprung from the astounding era of the 1880s, when, as as Alfred Gilead said, William Booth's young men and women went like a swift ocean wave out into the unknown, there to touch men and women of other races and cultures in the glory of Pentecostal brotherhood. These young warriors, our forebears, embodying the army, some of the army hallmarks of internationalism and gender equality, achieved wonders for the Lord in the early decades. as the pages of the journal Hallelujah stunningly show. But the hot metal was poured into a cold mould, 1929 notwithstanding. Until well on in the 20th century, top leadership down here was British, male and ageing. Some say this continues. Strong on loyalty and obedience, and a bit puzzled by the colonials' liking for egalitarianism. So you can see that there are those 3 steps. The base is tough. The Lord put a very high standard for holy leadership, and then in the army we've got some extra demands, let's put it. It is no surprise that we're having the discussions that we're having, given these things. Now we come to the historical case study of Florence. This paper considers the theme of holy leadership through the lens of the service of Brigadier Florence Birks, New Zealand's outstanding woman officer of the 20th century, intellectually and as an orator and spiritual leader. Florence Birks was born in 1889 in Gympie, I guess it is, Queensland. Gympie, thank you. Won to Christ as a teenager by the witness of the local holy leaders, and soon active in the corps, becoming, as the war cry said, a tireless worker at cry selling and collecting, and always ready with a word for the Lord. Called to service as an officer, Florence entered the Melbourne Training College right here in 1910. As you know, the territories were all under one hat until 1912. Her occupation listed on her service record as a general servant, and was appointed to assist Captain Alan Smith, first appointment back to New Zealand, in Patea, New Zealand, in the Taranaki. And the 2 women became lifelong comrades. Early in their service, this promising pair were chosen to join a company of 40 New Zealand officers chosen to represent the territory at the 1914 International Congress in London. Amazing to think of it now. Everyone thought the First War would be over very quickly, didn't they? And so the Congress went ahead. For the next 15 years, Smith and Birks, as they became known, together led 11 corps, including the largest in our territory, Dunedin City, Auckland City and Wellington City. Florence normally appointed assistant to Captain Smith, who was 6 years her senior. Everywhere, Florence's gifts as a speaker and Bible teacher were widely recognised. The Evening Post newspaper on 31st May 1924 announced, Adjutant Florence Birks, who is a splendid speaker and a great defender of the faith, will give an address entitled, A Drama in 2 Acts, the message to be supported by a choral rendition of The Feast of Belshazzar, with Commandant Nellie Smith as soloist. They knew how to do things. During their term at Wellington City Corps, Florence led a Bible class with at least 300 attending weekly, people coming by public transport from all over the city. But whether stationed at City Corps or in small provincial towns, Florence's leadership was the same. Her Bible message at the Timaru Corps on 17th of September 1927 on Luke's parable of the Great Feast began by, quote, briefly outlining world history so far as God's dealings are concerned. Her lyrical imaginative power gathered momentum as, striding the century, she portrayed the continual refusal of the king's invitation. Finally she came to the servant's mission, quote, there is nothing exclusive about the message this time. Nothing about going to the next of kin, not to the Jews, not to the Gentiles. This time it is for the whosoever. The final appeal is to be broadcasted, not from the temple, not from the pulpit, but, oh, wondrous grace of God, from the gutter. I'll just read a bit more of this sermon, this message. Didn't call them sermons then. Just to give you the flavour, the word limit of the text limited it down. On she goes. The servant is to go out into the highways and the byways, into the streets and lanes of the city. He is to go quickly, and to the poor and the maimed and the halt and the blind, and compel them to come in. Go to the highways? But who are to be found there? Why, the outcast and the outlaw. Here are the robbers and thieves and bandits. Go to them. They've never heard the glad news of the gospel. Go to them. They won't come to you. Go, and go quickly. Time is getting short. Oh, compel them to come in. Who was that servant who 60 years ago, this was 1927, who was that servant who 60 years ago, with beating drums and flying banners, marched out into the highways and byways of the world, with burning utterances out into the streets and lanes of the city, with yearning hearts searched out the robber and the outcast, the drunkard and the harlot? Who was that servant who went down into the slums, the alleys, the attics and the gutters, who went after the poor and the maimed and the halt and the blind, and with compelling power drew them in by the thousand? Oh, surely it was the Salvation Army. Joel says, in the latter days your handmaidens, etc. One of the signs of the end of the age, he's just put etc. This is the exact text, is to be the great company of women prophets. We have them in our salvation lassies. Look again at Nebuchadnezzar's vision, and then look again at the parable. Look at the two signs which precede the second coming of Christ. One is democracy, and the other is the gospel being delivered by a compelling club in the streets and lanes of the cities. And when God goes to the gutter, he can go no further. So the call went forth, renewed in the cottage meeting at Sister Mrs. Campbell's place on the following Tuesday, when Florence's notes show the theme being pursued with the same passionate panache. How are you servants of the King discharging your sacred duty? But the work was taking its toll. 2 short corps appointments straddling a year's furlough were followed in February 1931 by a complete change of work to Pakatoa Island. It's the Army's struggling centre that we had then, small island up in the north for women inebriates. From Pakatoa emanated 2 documents that are vintage Birks: a letter to a friend at court, the new Field Secretary, New Zealander, Lieutenant Colonel Fred Burton. He'd been an officer for 37 years and they finally made him the Field Secretary. So she wrote to him and sending also along a paper entitled "The Army's Young People with Suggested Up-to-Date Provision to Meet Their Varying Needs." Florence had views as far as youth work was concerned, and Colonel Burton had persuaded the Commissioner to have her write them up. I just mentioned one of the personal points of connection here is she sent this letter to Colonel Burton on the 25th of April 1931. I have another document at home. It's the Articles of War of my own mother, which were signed the very following day, the 26th of April 1931. My mother came from a disastrous and cruel home family background, and totally against the will of her mother, she was about to be enrolled as a senior soldier. Her mother tried every which way to stop her from being enrolled, telling the people down at the Corps that my mother was not worthy and not up to scratch and all this kind of thing. But luckily some people in the Corps stood up for Mum, and she did get enrolled. This, of course, is intriguing to me to see the dates of these 2 documents, this letter to Colonel Burton of Florence's, along with her paper with her views on the youth work of the Army, more of that in a moment, and then this document of my mum's Articles of War signed, as I think to myself, my mother full of passion and love and desire to serve God and sense of calling, and that this is where God was calling her. And what was the army that she was being called into? You know, much that she didn't know. Well, as I said, Florence had views as far as the youth work was concerned, and Colonel Burton had persuaded the Commissioner, yes, I said that, to have her write them up. To Colonel Burton she wrote, "Dear Sir and Brother, I have your command to write a paper. When Caesar says do this, it is performed. But, dear Colonel, you appear to me to be like the Christmas pudding, slightly mixed. In the first place, you do not tell me what the paper is for. Secondly, do you mean that I am to read it without comment? In that case, can I not say it, for I never speak from manuscript? Then to further insult my femininity, you ask me to say all I have to say in 5 minutes. I assure you, I surely shall not." A few more bits from the letter. "I have wondered if perchance you intended to ask me to read this paper at the Auckland Congress. I might say I do not expect to be there, as I am relieving the kitchen officer on Pakatoa for Congress. And in any case, none of us can stay longer than Monday, as the boat leaves Tuesday morning. Should the paper pass muster, and I know it won't, not being up to the standard of the milk and water concoctions which we invariably get dished out at these gatherings, I know it's far too revolutionary and red-blooded, but if the Commissioner reads it, that will be something attempted, something done to earn a night's repose. But as I was going to say, just supposing it does pass and has to be read sometime, somewhere, I would like above all things that you should read it for me. You know my mind and just where to lay emphasis. Of course it will be hissed, and that won't matter. Could I be present, no doubt I could emulate Charles Lamb. When an audience rose and hissed one of his plays, Lamb rose and hissed with them. And she's often referring to Captain Nellie Smith, her companion, as Saint Teresa. Saint Teresa and I are just about at the last gasp. We came to Pakatoa for a spell, but the place is in the death throes now. Only 7 women, and we will have 4 soon, which being interpreted means that the work of the island has now to be done by ourselves, as the women here at present are not only few in number, but incapable through sickness or disease. Our only man has been away for a month's holiday, and Major paid a woman who understands the psychology of separators and the cussedness of cows to take over that department. After 4 days, the lady aforesaid became ill and took to bed, so the poor matron has been spending her time in between managing the whole show, in attending to pigs' innards and cows' udders. Further, the bull's paddock carries prohibition months ago, and Teresa and I have had to carry 4 kerosene tins of water every day, a mile uphill to His Majesty and the lady who shares his paddock. Then the kitchen officer got knocked over and I had to take over the culinary department. In addition to all this, we've had to dig the ground and plant 300 or 400 strawberry plants, since which experience I've had a sympathetic understanding for the steward, for I've discovered, alas, that I cannot dig. Then she just has a bit to say about the state of things on the island. 2 months ago, she's still writing to Burton, her friend. 2 months ago, we wrote about this dangerous chimney here. At intervals through the past 2 years, the other officers here brought the matter before the Lord or the board. But the pilgrim who moves with steady pace, memories of Timaru, heeded them not in their anguish smile. So the poor beggars in this bleak and barren island shivered through the long dark winters with a kerosene lamp, but no fire, entertaining the magistrate and his committee, who sit in overcoats for their dinner because the chimney is unsafe. 2 months ago, in reply to our urgent SOS, the board sent Major Baltimore over to send in a requisition. Rotten boards, fallen chimney, rotten spoutings, leaking tanks, broken windows, and so on ad infinitum. Major Baltimore sent in the required statement, and the man who accompanied sent in the price, etc. The board must be still under the anaesthetic, for no reply comes from a void. Why worry? When 3 years of pleading fails, one must of necessity adopt other fouler means. So Teresa is sending to Auckland for a man to do the job and save the Army's property, after which we said, Mr. Scotney, the account. Savvy? That gentleman will begin to rear and plunge like a demented grasshopper, and will see more stars and comets than the astronomer Ropal could count in a month of Sundays. Still, there are limits to human endurance, and we have reached the limit. The paper in question, centred, that accompanied this, the paper that Florence had written, centred on the means of attracting and holding young people in the army. Florence was scornful of what she saw as the prevailing flattery and fripperies. This was all before Gen Y, isn't this intriguing? Some time ago she wrote, a staff officer said to me, if the Salvation Army is going to hold its catches, then it will have to do something more for its young people. I made reply, if the Salvation Army is going to hold its young people, then the young people will have to do something more for the army. Remembering the axiom of Euclid, the whole is greater than the part. With our strawberry socials and tennis courts, etc., etc., the Salvation Army is going the way of the YMCA. neglecting the private prayer of the upper room for the hilarity of the supper room. Though she was doubtful that her paper would gain a hearing at THQ since, quote, there are not enough genuflections to the staff in it, Florence laid out her testimony. Here's the first bit just before her testimony. She says, "Wherein then is the up-to-date remedy which I am asked to suggest for this Congress paper? My up-to-date remedy is anything but modern. The fundamentals of character must have their foundation in God. In the days of the tabernacle and the temple, there was no problem in securing the attendance of the youth of those days at public worship. But they were not attracted thither with strawberry socials and the like. Neither did Moses nor Solomon spend their time in collecting funds for tennis courts. They did not neglect the prayer of the upper room for the hilarity of the supper room. They attracted and held their youth by the attraction of the Shekinah glory, the ark of the testimony, the visible revelation of God." Then her testimony. "I was not 17 years of age when I attended for the first time a Salvation Army meeting. In that meeting, my young heart was captured. My soul was fired with the enthusiasm which made the martyrs. Until the day of my death, I registered the vow, these people shall be my people, and their God my God. How was this accomplished? By the Spirit of the living God, surely, but it was the Shekinah glory which captured me, the Shekinah which shone from the furrowed old faces on the platform. Here was indeed the ark of the testimony, the visible revelation of God. Did not St. Chrysostom say, the true Shekinah is man?" In 1934, yes, here we are, 1934, Florence was transferred to THQ in Wellington, to the Women's Social Department. And in January 1935, she was appointed Social Secretary. For the previous 4 years, the Women's Social Department had been under a lot of stress with breakdowns, things happening, and pro tem arrangements, including leadership for a period by the Territorial Commander and the Chief Secretary. That was a rather crucial matter. Taking up the role, Florence immediately assessed the national situation and seized the moment, building confidence in her team of women officers, identifying 3 of them to train for future leadership in maternity hospitals, and soliciting funds for the work. In November 1936, her letter to the editor of the Evening Post read, "Sir, at this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir. Like the nervous army captain making his Christmas appeal for the poor, we would say, we do not ask for abstract sympathy, but concrete plum puddings. Friend, what shall we put you down for? I am, etc. Major Florence Birks." But by that time, Florence was in extreme danger. Her 2 years as Women's Social Secretary were marked by rising conflict with the new Territorial Commander, Lieutenant Commissioner Fred Adams, resulting in Florence writing to General Evangeline Booth in March 1936. No copy of this letter has been traced, and the issues can only be seen through a glass very darkly in the written record of the Court of Inquiry that was conducted by Commissioner George Langdon from IHQ that began on the 3rd of December 1936. Those issues ranged over a number of things, territorial things, including the state of the Army institutions, which the leaders were always saying was marvellous, and Florence was saying were terrible, officer appointments. Florence believed that far too many good people had been sent out of the country and left the country very thin on very capable officers. Domination by English leadership, the fact that she believed that English leadership did not respect the New Zealand officers, nor did they have any time at all for study or serious education, things like that. Whole range of things like that, as well as personal things relating to allowances and accommodation arrangements and so forth. Florence was unwise enough to point out that there seemed to be a terrible lot of repairs being made always to the TC's quarters. And Commissioner Langdon from London rebuked Florence during this trial. Florence was accommodated at the training college in Arrow Street, for those who know it. Commissioner Langdon said to her, "You ought not to describe your room as a cubicle. It is an exceedingly well-positioned and nicely furnished bedroom." Central to all these things was the matter of equality for women officers. To the Territorial Commander, this Women's Social Secretary, leading like a man, went well beyond her brief. Florence saw it differently. In November 1936, she wrote to the recently installed Chief Secretary, Lieutenant Colonel George Grattan, on the question of loyalty. Florence wrote, "I would respectfully point out that there are two sides to every question. It is surely not British justice to pass a verdict before hearing evidence. When I have given the service of a lifetime to the cause which to me is infinitely more than life, I think it hardly necessary, after being in the country a little over 2 months, that you should feel it imperative to instruct me in regard to this matter. I would remind you that if leaders expect to receive loyalty from their subordinates, then they must show themselves worthy of it. The day of the divine right of kings is gone." The bone breaker was Florence's charge of nepotism relating to favours granted to the Territorial Commander's daughter, Adjutant Catherine Adams. As Kenneth Leach has observed, prophets are more concerned to see clearly than to behave well. Time would fail to detail the trial's content, and that may be a good thing, seeing this is a family show. But a few quotes from Commissioner Langdon taken from the verbatim record give the flavour. Commissioner Langdon said to her, "You cannot claim to be representing the New Zealand officers, for you are an Australian." Secondly, "You have only been a second or nearly all your life." Another one, in response to Florence's comments about orders being unreasonable, she was told, "That is not for you to say. It is for you to carry out the Commissioner's instructions." In reply to Florence's charge about unchristian inequality between women and men officers, she was told, "You have not the staff outlook." The weapons of bullying and sentimentality were freely wielded, with Colonel Burton gagged, the Territorial Commander calling Florence a twister, and Commissioner Langdon's clincher to her. "I do not think in your heart of hearts that you want to tell untruths or to mislead IHQ, but you have certainly done so." As Jean Vanier has quietly observed, certain ecclesial structures that strengthen clerical power are called to evolve under the inspiration of the Spirit. Encrypted cables flew between Wellington and IHQ, and the war cry of 26 December 1936 announced Florence's departure from THQ on health grounds. There were written protests from comrade officers, extraordinarily brave for the time. The depth of feeling can be gauged from Major Thelma Smith's comments long after, in 2006, that her officer parents had been shocked and ashamed, she said, when Florence was put on trial. But Major Thelma Smith also added, that these things could not and were not spoken. We understand that because of the constraints of loyalty and pain and all of that. Meantime, airless and grandiose correspondence flowed between THQ and IHQ, showing how holy leadership can be corroded and servanthood can morph into lordship. In February 1937, Lieutenant Commissioner Adams received a letter from the Chief of the Staff, Commissioner Henry Mapp, summing up Commissioner Langdon's visit. He was the commissioner who'd come down for the special investigation. Quote from Mapp: "Generally speaking, he is pleased with the meetings and the penitent form results, the spirit, etc. You have had a lot of unpleasantness in connection with Major Florence Birks. I'm very sorry that you have had such a painful and difficult experience at the hands of the Major. I rejoice in the way that the Lord has helped you. May he bless you and help you more and more. Believe me, dear Commissioner, yours affectionately, signed, Henry Mapp. P.S. We miss you and Mrs. Adams and Kath from Village Way. Those of you who know Beckenham and London will know that little street down there. Somewhere a voice is heard. You must do what they tell you, but do not do what they do. But there's always Australia. Thence Florence and Nellie sailed. A long, unseemly correspondence ensued, with neither leader in Sydney or in Wellington wanting to know or to pay. Florence received official letters, kindly but patronising, praying that, quote, during these weeks of quietness you may in a very real sense experience the companionship of our Master. Shades of your talk, Terry, huh? The self-freedom of Florence's reply is joyous. I just must read you a bit of this letter, her response to the Chief Secretary. She's writing from Maryborough up in Queensland. We have been in the midst of a heat wave over here, and the country has been experiencing a most critical time for want of rain. Bushfires have been also causing much damage. It is a thrilling sight to see an area strewn with logs, branches, roots and scrub becoming a conflagration. I rode out last week to witness that which used to be a common sight in my childhood days. Many furnaces before us, leaping one to another, and many rivers of flame spreading and joining, parting and thinning and widening again. Clouds and wreaths of smoke, white from the dead, dry material, black from the greener logs. The constant crackle of timber being consumed, and showers of sparks and fragments of wood from stacked heaps, and whirlings of mingled dust and ashes, where long imprisoned gases are suddenly released from smashing roots and stumps. The smoke gathers as it rises and becomes a mass that grows and swells and billows to the sky in mingled plumes of flame. She continues to the Chief Secretary. Everything over here is on a vast scale, for Australia is as large as Germany, France, Belgium, Holland, Switzerland and Italy combined. It is 25 times as large as Great Britain. Don't you love this woman? On she goes. The Australian exile of these two officers lasted for 3.5 years, with Florence taking only one appointment as assistant officer at Toowoomba Corps for 5 months. Then, in 1940, came a new territorial commander for New Zealand, Commissioner J. Evan Smith, and an opportunity to heal this running sore, an inspired appointment, and an announcement in the war cry that Major Birks had been appointed training principal in New Zealand. The Australian war cry said, the new principal's last appointment as commanding officer of Toowoomba Corps was of a temporary character. Oh boy. For some time, Major Birks has been awaiting an appointment. Major Alan Smith, for the best part of 2 years, has been filling responsibility as divisional secretary in Newcastle. So there was the appointment. From the People's Palace, Newcastle, Florence replied to the territorial commander, this is a very gracious gesture which is fully appreciated. Nothing would have given us greater pleasure than to have resumed duty. However, as IHQ has failed on 2 occasions to keep their word to us, we cannot see our way clear to return officially until such time as confidence is restored. But things were sorted, and they did return to New Zealand, leading 4 glorious training sessions, mainly of women cadets, from 1940 to 1943. It was during the war, of course. Holdfast, Crusaders, Steadfast Session, and Valiant. At the Training College Welcome Tea, the Chief Secretary stated that the 2 majors' quote, record was second to none. And at the public welcome, Commissioner Evan Smith, on behalf of the General, assured them that their leaders in the Army had, quote, complete confidence in them. A former cadet remembers her training principal as a strict disciplinarian, an orator supreme. She said, we hung on every word. Even now, after 60 years, her words come back to mind, edifying, inspiring and encouraging. We were all in awe of her presence. Comrade women officers have spoken in recent years of Florence holding aloft the principle of equality, being well-informed, articulate and devoted to her God and his calling. They spoke of her dignity and brightness of bearing, describing her as positive, forward-thinking, appealing greatly to young people and to people who wanted to think about things. She was a prophet of the possible, able to spot leadership qualities and potential in people, and, quote, to give people a vision of what they could be. She was an orator and a leader ahead of her time. The training college years were glorious but short. When Brigadier Ellen Smith retired at age 60, Florence went too at only 54. They were provided with a, quote, poor primitive cottage. They used the hand basin for washing, or they went for a swim in the sea. That was the quote from another officer, not from them. Eventually, Florence bought this little place from the army, but her will states that ultimately the house, quote, shall be used as a home for retired single women Salvation Army officers who, on retirement, have no place to live. The conclusion. In short, as I said at the beginning, the gospel makes impossible demands of all followers, with the bar set even higher for leaders. Further, in the army, we have got a structure within which, despite consultative modifications, a servant leadership course, an official statement on the dangers of spiritual abuse, autocracy continues, sometimes waning, but like weapons decommissioned after war, not put beyond use. This system induces passivity in followers and takes a terrible toll on prophets, as Florence and others illustrate. The stooping figure in John 13 haunts us, but the lived appropriation of servanthood does not follow easily. Peter's protest against the destabilization of society inherent in Jesus' quintessentially servile role is ours also, but we draw back from confronting the evidence, historical and contemporary, of servant-like techniques, ironically including participation being accepted uncritically to manipulate others in our one army. Hard-pressed leaders can become used to justifying unholy means to achieve holy ends. We're easily diverted by fear or indifference from wrestling with this question of means and ends, a diversion corrosive of holy leadership and dangerously likely to stifle our love for the work, for the people. We cease to care. And that caring goes wide. There's an article in a New Zealand paper just recently by an expert advisory group on child poverty, on which Campbell Roberts is a member. And these experts just put it straight out to us at large that we don't care. So whether it's that or things like the Mediterranean as a grave now, I've read that 20,000 people have gone down, refugees and migrants have gone down into the sea in the last 20 years. 20,000. Sudan, all these places. Our caring gets blunted and diverted into other preoccupations too easily. Our autocratic structure, accepted in 1878 to spur action, can paradoxically have the reverse outcome if it's true that how we travel is where we arrive. So to finally conclude, given Florence's story, this history of these structures, shouldn't we just give up and pack up? And yet Florence signals no. At the end of the 1931 paper on the Army's young people, she recalls Gideon's 300, and then her mind leapt millennia ahead. Does not the emancipator of Italy come to mind here? Listen again to Garibaldi's appeal to the youth of his country. I am going out from Rome. Let those who wish to continue the war come after me. I offer neither pay, nor quarters, nor provisions. I offer hunger and thirst, forced marches, battles and death. Let him who loves his country in his heart and not with his lips follow me. And 1,000 men responded to the call, going out with him to the wilderness. That is my up-to-date remedy, the Shekinah glory attracting and the conquest of the cross compelling. Secondly, there is in Florence's 1931 letter to Colonel Burton from the hard slog on Pakatoa Island, she ended up saying to Colonel, well, I must go and offer my incense to the great god Frying Pan and allow the ladies to consume my burnt offerings. She added, while struggling up the hill with 2 tins of water the other day, the devil asked me what I thought of the wisdom of an administration which set Blinko, Colonel Blinko, who was in the training college at that time, Colonel Viola Blinko, which the wisdom of an administration which set Blinko to instruct its future exponents and Birks to water its bulls. I told him to rub it in his hair. And she added, sincere salams from St. Teresa feeding the swine, and yours humbly cleaning out the fowl house, Florence Birks. Thirdly, a greater than Florence is here. Hear him and his fiery truth. You have one teacher and all of you are brothers, and you have only one leader, Christ, followed by this. The greatest among you will be your servant.